On the one hand, while they will present a friendly face to us and they'll send us cute panda bears to the Washington National Zoo, they're telling their people that America is the enemy. I think one thing we can be very grateful to Xi Jinping about is that the mask is off. Whether it's the wolf warrior diplomacy, the aggression towards Taiwan, towards the Philippines, and we call it the South China Sea, maybe we should start calling it the West Philippine Sea.
Are we finally seeing a real pivot to Asia as the Trump administration signals a dramatic reduction in the U.S. military presence in Europe and demands NATO allies pitch in more for Europe's defense? Joining me today is longtime China expert Piero Tozzi, staff director of the Congressional Executive Commission on China, the CECC.
There's forced labor in the fishing, but there's also forced labor in the fish processing. Well, this enters the U.S. supply chain, including our procurement by our Defense Department, served on military bases, but also U.S. Department of Agriculture purchases for federal prisons and school lunch programs. The U.S. government should be setting the example in cleansing our supply chain of products that are tainted by forced labor. It should be a no-brainer.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. Piero Tozzi, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Well, very good to be here, Jan. Thank you for inviting me.
Vice President J.D. Vance recently at the Munich Security Conference gave a speech. Some people hailed it, others found it incredibly controversial and criticized it. A lot of focus on free speech, but that wasn't the only focus. And how do you read it?
Well, I think germane to our conversation today, I think we're seeing a pivot to Asia. And that's something that's been talked about for some time. President Obama spoke about it as well. And with this administration, we're seeing a realization, a reprioritization of where does America need to put its assets. And I think it's an understanding that the People's Republic of China, under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping, is not simply a strategic rival. We're not simply competing with them on economics, even militarily, but rather they're what I would call a systemic rival. In other words, they seek to be hegemon, and as part of that, they seek to undo the entire rules-based international order and supplant it with one of their own devising, which I think accounts for their not just military aggressiveness, but also you see this effort to set standards. It's the hegemon that sets the standards, whether it's in technology, whether it's seeking to undermine the dollar as the reserve currency, and you see that I think with BRICS and issues like the petro yen. But you also see it in the area of human rights. You see the CCP, the PRC, putting forward this notion of a shared common destiny for mankind, a changing of rights as we think of it as principally about protecting individual freedoms, and transforming into collective rights, a right to development. And if you look at the Universal Periodic Review of China last year, January of 24, you had a number of countries that lined up to praise China as a rights leader, whereas the U.S. and like-minded countries, including our East Asian allies like Japan and Korea, South Korea was pretty vocal too, criticized China's human rights record. So I think there's an attempt to, as the PRC seeks hegemony as the CCP, and I think here it's important to make that distinction between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese nation, the Chinese people. They seek to conflate that, but really they have their goals are systemic.
A few vantage points here. The first one is, where has just very briefly, I want you to comment on where systems that have adopted the idea of collective rights as guidance, where have they taken us?
Well, I think you saw that with the Soviet Union. It's inherent in communism, the extinguishment of the individual. We become cogs in a machine, and one of the, I think, what's inherent in our Western system, and it's based really on this the notion of the individual created in the image and likeness of God. I mean, that's really where it begins. So it is this Judeo-Christian notion.
There's this inherent value to each individual.
To each individual life. Now, and we can maybe talk a little bit more about this later too. I think in this notion, though, that rights are alien to the Chinese tradition, which was something that was a Communist Party talking point that you're probably familiar with this document number 9, the 2013 document that circulated internally among Chinese Communist Party leadership, which basically is it's coterminous with the rise of Xi Jinping to power, which attacked the notion of universality of rights as something that's alien to the Chinese tradition. It is not. And it also attacked, for example, the notion of constitutional government, separation of power, direct election, and democracy, saying that this is alien. It's contrary to the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, but it's not contrary to the Chinese tradition. It's framed a little bit differently, but that has very deep roots. You know, Mencius talks about the people as being, the interest of the people as being paramount. Second come the grains and altars, the functions of the state, and last comes the emperor. So I think you see in Confucian thought a notion of individual dignity and also a law above the law. This idea of heaven seeing with the eyes of the people and hearing with the ears of the people, which is a very ancient notion.
Again, so many things we could jump off of here. This is a good moment to talk about how the Chinese Communist Party has been explaining America to the Chinese people under communism, in contrast to how it talks to the Americans.
Right. Well, that's, I think, something that's always very interesting. What are they saying to their own people using Chinese language? And that's, I think, one of the reasons why the study of Chinese is important, so that we can understand what is being said in the Chinese media, what messages are being delivered. You know, there's the Middle East Media Research Institute, MEMRI. We really need something along those lines for understanding what is being said about America. One very important figure, I think, in formulating the strategy at the highest levels is a fellow named Wang Huning, who had studied in the United States and had a very negative opinion of the United States, and wrote a book that was actually translated into English, America Against America. What's interesting about him, too, is he's been a survivor. He's had the ear of Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and now Xi Jinping.
So the last three dictators.
The last three, yes. The last three general secretaries of the Communist Party. I don't like to call them president. That's a mistranslation. You know, the Chinese word is not zongtong, which we would talk about President Lai Ching-te of Taiwan, a democratically elected leader. The Chinese Communist Party is Marxist-Leninist. It's, you know, Mao, Xi Jinping thought has had a tremendous influence, but in some ways it's also a Chinese legalist. You know, we had two competing philosophies in ancient China. Legalism, which was proto-totalitarianism, and it's this concept of rule by law as opposed to rule of law, and we can talk about that with Xi Jinping as well, and that. And then on contrast is Confucianism, which we talked about as sort of proto-democratic, as a concept somewhat akin to human rights or human dignity inherent in it. This ideology, I think, is also manifest in the Chinese state. In some ways, it's a legalist regime onto which you've glommed onto it Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, Shiism. Wang Huning, in some ways, he's a nationalist. He's in some ways a legalist. I mean, he's someone very highly placed who does make criticisms of Marxism, but from within the Chinese tradition. You know, what's interesting is that Confucianism gives legitimacy to the state, so there's always been an effort by the Chinese state to co-opt Confucianism. And you see that, for example, the labeling of Confucius Institutes. There's a TV show when Marx met Confucius there. But the Confucian tradition is actually very antithetical to this totalitarian rule, to tyranny. It's legalism, and sometimes people conflate the two. But it's Chinese legalism that is the extolation of the state. A lot of people, when Xi Jinping came to power back in 2013, they saw him as someone committed to rule of law. The word in Chinese, fa zhi, can be translated as rule of law or rule by law. And I think what's become apparent is that Xi Jinping uses law, for example, anti-corruption law, to purge rivals. It's not a consistent standard. You look at his own family, there's a lot of corruption there, and that runs throughout the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, which is probably one reason why they're afraid of this report that's supposed to be made and have been lobbying against. There was a statute that was passed that said that the Director of National Intelligence should issue both a private report, confidential report, but also a public-facing one that discusses the wealth of senior Chinese Communist Party officials. That has been delayed. I would hope that the Trump administration releases it, because I think that will also impact public opinion in China. That also goes two ways too. And what we want to see, I think, is that free flow of information. To go back to a point you made at the beginning about J.D. Vance's speech, that idea of free speech as being important, that I think is really important in the China sphere. So evading the great firewall of China, making information available to the Chinese people, I think is very important.
How does the Chinese regime teach the Chinese people about America and its role in the world versus to how it communicates to Americans or to the American leadership?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Post Tiananmen, when the Chinese people, as an expression of popular will, demanded democracy, demanded freedom, the CCP did a couple of things. One was they sort of made this grand bargain with the Chinese people to say that, as we develop economically, you'll be enriched, and just don't challenge our rule, that of the CCP. And that was sort of the promise, during the so-called reform era, when it attracted a lot of direct foreign investment. They also suppressed any discussion of Tiananmen, which is why, again, goes to that issue of the Great Firewall and things that you can't, Google these ideas in China. We see that with artificial intelligence. There are certain subjects that are verboten, they're forbidden. But the other thing that they did is they really cultivated this sense of nationalistic grievance against the United States, but also against other countries. We've seen Japan, for example, is vilified and demonized, and we've seen a series of really horrific knife attacks against Japanese citizens in China, including a little child there who was attacked. But we've seen it also, knife attacks against Americans. There was an Israeli diplomat, I think, who was also attacked as well. Where does that come from? Well, it is this under the guise of patriotic education, but really it's fanning nationalistic anti-Americanism, anti-Westernism. It's this whole series of grievances, that century of shame, the Opium Wars and the like. In fact, I think, we do know that the PRC, that it supplies fentanyl to the U.S., and that I think is by design, the CCP. Part of that, I think, is in their minds. It's asymmetric warfare, and we can talk about that, where everything is a multi-front battlefield, but its justification is the Opium War. Now, pointing out that was really Great Britain and not the United States, yet that all becomes conflated. So if Americans are dying from fentanyl overdoses, I think in the mind of the CCP, it's deserved. And that is part of that that extreme nationalism. And I think what also carries over here, we see with even some of the Chinese students who come over here, that they harbor these extreme nationalistic views. But who do they target? Oftentimes they target other Chinese students that are studying in the United States and that are kind of breathe that freedom and want to speak freely and are developing their own thoughts. So you see things like the Chinese Students and Scholars Association that works in conjunction with Chinese embassies, the embassy and consulates here, that essentially suppress and oppress other Chinese students there, and also Tibetans and Uyghurs. I think if you want to sum up, what is this nationalistic education and inculcation of this extreme nationalism about? I mean, ultimately everything is about the Chinese Communist Party maintaining power. And to do that, they need to externalize an enemy, especially now as the economy is failing. We talked about, part of that grand bargain post-Tiananmen would be, you would prosper and you would not challenge the Communist Party's rule. The economy is failing under Xi Jinping. It's sputtering. So what they, I think, as an alternative there, you direct your animus away from the party towards external targets, and that would be the United States. So on the one hand, while they will present a friendly face to us, and they'll send us cute panda bears to the Washington National Zoo, they're telling their people that America is the enemy.
And I mean, and they've been doing that for decades, right?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, since the time of the 1949, what happens right after that? The Korean War. And, America is the enemy. You did have a bit then the rapprochement in the Nixon era, but definitely post-Tiananmen, that idea of America as the enemy has been inculcated too. So and again, it's that extreme nationalism.
It can be very hard to imagine because basically since Tiananmen, Americans have been hand over fist trying to get into China, do anything, transfer all the necessary IP, offer all the technology voluntarily, invest insane amounts into places where it didn't look like a quick return was coming. How do you explain this?
Well, that I think goes to the whole kind of mistake of engagement theory. Mm-hmm. And, if you want to talk a little about the Congressional Executive Commission on China, how did we come about? Well, we came about, if you look at post-Tiananmen, there was a realization that the regime was brutal. China's most favored nation status in terms of trade was up for annual review. It was they had to show that they were making improvements in human rights, and then it was reauthorized. Now, Bill Clinton, when he was candidate Bill Clinton, rightfully criticized George H.W. Bush. After Tiananmen and the massacre there, George H.W. Bush sent Brent Scowcroft to Beijing to reassure them that, okay, everything will be all right. And Clinton had that famous phrase, he's coddling butchers from Beijing to Baghdad. But then what happened in 1994, Bill Clinton delinked that annual review process and human rights and basically gave them permanent normal trade relation status. There were a number of voices that criticized that, including Chris Smith. He very presciently said that this is a mistake. We're mistaking the nature of the regime. Nancy Pelosi was another critic at that time. Anyway, over the decade of the 1990s, you had this lead up towards the PRC's accession to the World Trade Organization, which is, I think, in many ways how we really started to give up the store then. The idea that you could take a regime that is mercantilist, it's a communist command economy that's able to devote resources to particular, not just industries, but particular companies. It's able to subsidize low prices through the use of forced slave labor, and also steals intellectual property to give it an upper hand. If you look at the Canadian company Nortel, how its demise, it should be but
well, it's how Huawei was arguably constructed at the beginning.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, that's Huawei's rise to power. It cannibalized another telecom company that was so eager to get into the China market. So that was a mistake that was made. As part of that WTO accession, the Congressional Executive Commission on China was created to monitor China's human rights record, and ironically, part of it was to kind of map its progress towards a rule of law society, which again sort of kind of shows that heady optimism at the time, but also to maintain a political prisoner database and to keep Congress informed. What people thought would be progress now is, I think it's very clear, is regress. And the abuse of human rights is ongoing and systematic.
But Piero, all along through this, the Chinese regime was teaching the Chinese people over generations that America is the enemy and the cause of the Chinese people's problems, not the CCP, right? As you said, to externalize the enemy for all the terrible things the party had done. Right. So, but my point is, again, like we just didn't notice that somehow?
Well, again, I think they present one face to the rest of the world, and that was especially true with during the reform era, when they wanted to attract foreign direct investment. And so they present one face to the rest of the world, and then it's a very different message to their own people. I think one thing we can be very grateful to Xi Jinping about is that the mask is off. Whether it's the wolf warrior diplomacy, whether it's the aggression towards Taiwan, towards the Philippines, and we call it the South China Sea. Maybe we should start calling it the West Philippine Sea. That aggressiveness towards India on its border, I think the mask is off, and its intentions are much clearer for those that want to see. And we're also seeing, I think, a withdrawal of Western companies, Western law firms, that have realized that this was a bad bargain that was made. You still, however, it's difficult to extricate yourself. If you're a company like Microsoft or Apple, not only is a great deal of your production in China, but also that's where your research and development is. We've outsourced so much to a country, again, that seeks to be the hegemon, and also seeks to foster this spirit of grievance and hostility towards the United States too.
So, Pierre, are you telling me that you're going to be submitting a recommendation to the White House for the renaming of another body of water?
I think that they don't need my input to do that. But it's funny, it's not even called the South China Sea in Chinese, Nanhai. It's the South Sea. Yet we do oftentimes adopt this terminology that favors them. We talked about calling Xi Jinping president when the word in Chinese is not president. We should give him his party title. We also adopt language like the South China Sea. So in some ways, we're doing their own propaganda for them, which raises an interesting role. We talked,
Well, a very prominent example in the other direction was the renaming of, Wuhan virus to something else.
Right. Traditionally you would call, for example, the Spanish flu, you would talk about the point of origin, and but that was.
But it's interesting. It kind of works in both directions, right? Things that are, beneficial and things that are harmful. That also seems to get renamed.
Yeah. No, that's there's a Confucian concept of zhenming, the rectification of names, and it's a very important principle. You should call things by their accurate name, and that's a very important starting point, because if the premise is mistaken, the conclusion is going to be mistaken. So it's very important to get those names accurate.
And yet another reason why it'd be very valuable to have some more traditional Chinese thought, basically adopted by the powers that be in China. But here, the thing that you're really getting me thinking about is this, these two faces being shown, right? One internally, one externally. I mean, there's this whole approach. I mean, since I think it's 2013, of the use of the three warfares: psychological warfare, public opinion warfare, and legal warfare, to attack the West.
So, I think the roots of that are very deep. Another Chinese thinker, Sun Tzu, that people are familiar with. You want to defeat an enemy ideally without combat, without any casualties. So that's the roots of it. But if you look at the United Front or United Front Works Department activities, since the inception of the Chinese Communist Party, they attempted to influence the Kuomintang, infiltrate the Kuomintang, find sectors of society, media, that they could influence. You have movements like the May 4th movement in 1919, which is this nationalistic student movement, preceded the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. That movement, though, was also co-opted. So this United Front mentality is something that is ingrained in the strategy of the Chinese Communist Party. And it's not so much about intelligence gathering or taking what's in your mind and there, but putting thoughts in your mind, putting good feelings about China in your mind. Fast forward, there was a book that was written in 1999 by two Chinese colonels, Colonel Wang and Colonel Liao, that called for unrestricted warfare. If you look at that and sort of its more formal articulation in the three warfares, you'll see the strategy there. Every thing short of kinetic is a battlefield. So we talked about fentanyl earlier. So fentanyl is an effort at asymmetric warfare. But part of it is that media and communications to present a benign view of China and the CCP and its intentions to the world in order to lull them and to compromise them and to weaken resistance.
So I just want to clarify one thing for those who might not be in the know. Earlier, you were talking about the United Front and these efforts to infiltrate, subvert, influence. First of all, kind of early movement, sort of proto-democratic movement, or the Nationalist Party in China. What is this United Front?
It's part of the China's propaganda efforts. I think Mao talked about it as his secret weapon. It's, in many ways, he attributed it to what allowed them to defeat the Kuomintang in mainland China and to come to power.
The nationalist.
The nationalists, the KMT, the Chiang Kai-shek's parties that struggled, if you want to personify it, Mao Zedong versus Chiang Kai-shek, but it really was more than just a clash of titans. It was, the very alternative visions of what China's future would look like. And the Kuomintang in 1949 fled to Taiwan. So to give an example of United Front activity, just very recent here in Washington, D.C., two examples. There were two United Front operatives who were welcomed with open arms by here in Washington just a few weeks ago. And they were two panda bears, Bao Li and Qing Bao. And if you look at the media coverage, these cute and wonderful panda bears, full of praise and a gift of the People's Republic of China. A little bit of irony there, Bao Li and Qingbao, we see the, in pinyin romanized words. Chinese love puns. A lot of Chinese dissidents use puns to kind of express their criticism of the Chinese Communist Party leadership. However, it goes two ways. Bao Li is a homonym for violence, explosive violence. Qingbao can mean intelligence in the sense of like spycraft, intelligence gathering. So one wonders if sort of the joke is on us there. The other example of United Front kind of trying to create goodwill towards China was the Kennedy Center, which is a taxpayer-funded venue, hosting the National Ballet of China. And Chris Smith led a letter along with Congressman Molinar from the Select Committee. Chris Smith is the chairman of the Congressional Executive Commission on China. Wrote to the Kennedy Center and called attention to the fact that this CCP suppresses artists at home and also abroad. Now, we do want to, we're all in favor of artistic expression and we don't want to be censorious here. But I think what the letter called for is like, will you let your audiences know that there are artists that are repressed in China, but also here, this long arm of transnational repression. To give an example, there's Chen Weiming is a Chinese sculptor who had a sculpture in California. There's this Liberty Sculpture Park that contains a lot of his artwork. And one of them was the CCP virus, and it showed Xi Jinping as a CCP virus, essentially. Mm-hmm. A month after it was opened, it was burned down, and the FBI investigated, and it turns out there were agents of the Chinese Communist Party that did that and attacked that form of artistic expression. Another example, too, the Chinese artist lives in Australia now, Baidu Cao. He does these kind of cartoon posters that show the how repressive the CCP is. His artwork has been attacked. And this is actually a very interesting example, I think, of the confluence of Chinese Communist Party efforts to suppress freedom of expression on campus and also to tap into something that so there was an incident at George Washington University a couple of years ago where Baidu Cao's posters were put up to show this the repressiveness of the regime against the Chinese people and Uyghurs and others. The Chinese Students and Scholars Association claimed that this was racist against Chinese students, that we were being oppressed. The initial reaction of the university was to ban the posters. This was ironic because they were calling attention to the oppressive actions of the CCP against the Chinese people who were oppressed, against also Tibetans and Uyghurs, these oppressed minorities, but also Han Chinese as well. And that's very interesting because another example of sort of the United Front, I mean, remember, these are Marxists, so they understand the dialectic. They understand that notion of oppressor versus oppressed. And they tap into this current that you see in the American left, but you also see especially in academia, the whole intersectionality, this kind of cultural Marxist construct where everything is seen as, look, these are legitimate conversations to have about race and racism and whatever, but this mindset that you have oppressors and oppressed, what the oppressor was doing, the Chinese Communist Party, was they were claiming the mantle of oppressed and seeking to squelch voices that called attention to that. The actual oppressed are Chinese students who dare to think differently, those that seek to practice religion, Falun Gong, for example, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, and it's the CCP that oppresses it. So you see, for example, most egregiously, at the APEC conference in San Francisco last year, how demonstrators against Xi Jinping were beaten by pro-CCP demonstrators. They were exercising their First Amendment freedoms on this, they were permitted on in San Francisco. One of the terrible things from that, and we held a press conference, CECC, Chairman Smith held a press conference of some of the victims who were beaten, and representatives from Uyghur, Tibetan, and Hong Kong groups as well as Chinese dissidents. The lack of responsiveness by the San Francisco police and the San Francisco authorities. We've also seen it again on college campuses. We had a hearing in conjunction with June 4th, the Tiananmen anniversary last year, where we had a student from Columbia University who testified incognito because her and her friends were targeted, physically, beaten for speaking up for human rights. Another example, there was in Massachusetts, there was I think it was Berklee College of Music student who was attacked by another student and beaten there. That student was who attacked the dissident student was arrested and jailed. We had a hearing on American prisoners in China that fortunately led to the release of Pastor David Lin just in advance of the hearing, and then we had Mark Swadan was released, whose mother provided a video testimony at our hearing. Also Harrison Lee's father, one of our witnesses at that hearing, was also released, which was great. I mean, we really, that was a great accomplishment. But I believe the student who, CCP student who had attacked the other Chinese student, who had victimized that Chinese student, was also released in exchange. So that goes to, I think, the point that you were raising earlier, how that cultivation of extreme nationalism